The jungle breathed, not with wind, there was no wind that morning, but with the wet, living weight of a million leaves drinking the last of the night's rain. November 1943. Bougainville, the northernmost of the Solomon Islands, a spine of volcanic rock and triple canopy green that the Imperial General Staff had marked as impregnable. The Japanese commanders had promised their troops that no American force could sustain itself here, not in this heat, not without roads, not 2,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. They had promised the jungle itself would be their ally. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about almost everything. The error began with a sound. Not the crack of rifle fire or the thump of naval guns, but something stranger. The hum of refrigeration units cycling on inside canvas tents, the metallic clatter of field kitchens unpacking crates of fresh eggs, the low diesel growl of bulldozers carving airstrips from swamp in 48 hours. The Japanese scouts who crept to the edges of the American perimeter at Cape Torokina returned with reports their officers refused to believe. The enemy was eating ice cream. The enemy had electric lights. The enemy had brought the future into the jungle, and the jungle was losing. This is the story of how logistics became a weapon, how underestimation became a fatal miscalculation, and how a war in the green hell of the South Pacific was won not only by courage but by forklifts, by generators, by the unglamorous machinery of industrial power projection. It is the story of how American forces turned Bougainville from a Japanese fortress into a graveyard, not through superior ferocity, though there was ferocity, but through a kind of warfare the Empire had never encountered, the systematic, mechanized, relentless application of supply. And at the heart of it, threading through the radio chatter and the manifests and the night operations, was a woman whose call sign was Actual 6, whose specialty was tonnage per hour calculations, and whose letters home would not be opened by her mother until 3 years after the war ended. The invasion fleet materialized out of the pre-dawn mist on the 1st of November like a city afloat. 14,000 men of the 3rd Marine Division, accompanied by the 37th Infantry Division, riding in transports that stretched to the horizon. The naval bombardment began at 5:45 hours, a rolling thunder that walked inland from the beach in 100-yard increments, methodical as a metronome. But the real shock came after the Marines hit the sand. Behind them, riding the 2nd and 3rd waves, came something the Japanese had not accounted for: the machinery. LSDs, landing ship, tank, ground their bow ramps into the black volcanic sand and disgorged not just men but entire systems. Forklifts descended the ramps before the infantry had cleared the tree line. Cranes, still dripping seawater, swung palletized ammunition onto the beach. Trucks, not jeeps, but 2.5-ton cargo trucks, rolled inland within the first hour, following engineers who were already staking out supply dumps with the efficiency of warehouse managers. The Marines secured a perimeter 300 yards deep. By noon, that perimeter had electric light. The Japanese defenders, dug into positions a mile inland, expected a conventional assault, infantry advancing, taking casualties, grinding forward through attrition. What they observed instead, through field glasses and from the cover of spider holes, was something closer to a construction project. The Americans were not just fighting, they were building. By the second day, there were fuel bladders holding 10,000 gallons positioned behind revetments. By the third, a field hospital with surgical lighting and sterilization equipment was treating wounded men who, in previous campaigns, would have died of infection. The Japanese officers sent increasingly frantic radio messages to Rabaul. The translations, intercepted by Navy cryptanalysts, carried a recurring phrase: unnatural advantage. The architect of much of this advantage was a 31-year-old logistics officer named Miriam Ashford, call sign Actual 6, who had designed the offload sequencing for the first 72 hours while still aboard the USS Macaulay. She was not supposed to be on Bougainville at all. Her orders had been to remain shipboard, coordinating resupply from the relative safety of the transport anchorage. She came ashore on D+1 with a clipboard, a sidearm she had never fired in combat, and a reputation among the beach masters as the only officer who could recalculate crane tonnage rates in her head while standing in the rain. The men called her the Freight Queen, though never to her face. She moved through the supply dumps with the focused intensity of a chess player 3 moves ahead, rerouting bottlenecks before they formed, repositioning fuel and ammunition based on intelligence updates that sometimes arrived only minutes before Japanese counterattacks. Her letters home, brief, penciled on the back of requisition forms, revealed nothing of this. "Mother, the weather is wet. The work is fine. I am learning to sleep through noise." What Miriam understood and what the Japanese did not was that Bougainville was never meant to be taken by assault. It was meant to be occupied, held, and transformed into a platform. The island sat astride the sea lanes to Rabaul, the massive Japanese naval and air complex 300 miles northwest. Rabaul could not be stormed. It was too heavily defended, too far from friendly bases. But it could be neutralized. If American forces could build airfields on Bougainville, if they could sustain bomber operations and fighter sweeps from those airfields, Rabaul would become a prison, its 100,000 troops and hundreds of aircraft irrelevant, bypassed, starved. The strategy was elegant. The execution required moving a mountain of materiel across 2,000 miles of ocean and then keeping it moving inland, through mud and heat and sniper fire. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their logistical doctrine assumed fortified positions would be supplied by sea and that garrison troops would supplement rations through local foraging. Bougainville's jungle offered almost nothing: taro, some wild pig, coconut. The American supply chain, by contrast, operated on a principle of redundancy that bordered on excess. Each Marine was allocated 4,000 calories per day. The ration crates included not just hardtack and canned meat but coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and improbably powdered lemonade. The psychological effect was measurable. Men who ate hot meals and slept under mosquito netting fought harder. Men who received mail from home, delivered by air every 3 days, had lower rates of combat fatigue. The Japanese soldiers, surviving on 600 grams of rice per day and occasional fish, began to understand they were fighting not just an enemy, but an entire system. By the end of the first week, the Americans had carved 3 airstrips from the coastal plain. The engineers worked around the clock, Marston matting, pierced steel planking, laid in interlocking sections over compacted coral. The first fighter planes landed on November 8th, less than a week after the invasion. By mid-month, Marine Corsairs were flying combat air patrols over the fleet anchorage, and Army Air Force bombers were staging through Bougainville to hit targets around Rabaul. The Japanese, watching from the hills, saw their air superiority evaporate in a matter of days. The strategic miscalculation was rooted in an older conflict, one of perception. Japanese intelligence had assessed American troops as soft, reliant on luxury, unsuited to jungle warfare. The assessment was based on observations from earlier campaigns, on propaganda images of American affluence, on a belief that industrial wealth produced weak soldiers. Bougainville shattered that narrative. The Americans brought their industry with them. They did not adapt to the jungle, they mechanized it. Roads appeared where there had been only trails. Bridges spanned rivers in 72 hours. Supply convoys ran at night under blackout conditions, guided by engineers who had surveyed the routes by day. The jungle, which the Japanese had counted as an ally, became just another logistical problem, difficult but solvable. Radio traffic from Japanese positions grew increasingly desperate. Intercepts revealed units requesting permission to withdraw, reporting casualties not from enemy fire but from disease and malnutrition. The American perimeter expanded not through bloody frontal assaults but through steady, grinding pressure. Artillery barrages followed by infantry sweeps, followed by engineers extending the road network, followed by supply trucks bringing up ammunition and rations for the next push. The Japanese were not being defeated. They were being starved out, cut off, rendered irrelevant. There was fighting, of course. The jungle was never quiet. Japanese forces launched night infiltration raids, trying to reach the airfields, trying to destroy the fuel dumps that fed the American air campaign. Some of these raids succeeded. On the night of November 7th, a Japanese battalion penetrated to within 200 yards of the main supply depot before being stopped by a mixed force of engineers and rear-echelon troops who had trained for this exact scenario. The battle lasted 4 hours. By dawn, the Japanese had withdrawn, leaving behind 100 dead. The Americans lost 16. The supply depot resumed operations by noon. Miriam Ashford was on the perimeter that night. She had been conducting an inventory of medical supplies when the shooting started. Her memories of the engagement, recorded in a letter written 3 weeks later, were fragmented. I remember the tracer rounds looked like red fireflies. I remember thinking someone should shut off the generator so the noise would stop. I remember a corpsman asking me to hold a flashlight while he worked, and my hands would not stay steady. She did not mention that the corpsman later credited her with saving his life, that she had shot a Japanese soldier who had come around the corner of a supply tent with a grenade in his hand. She did not mention this because she did not remember doing it. The Japanese perception of American forces began to shift. Intelligence reports sent back to Rabaul described the enemy as industrially possessed, a phrase that captured both fear and incomprehension. How could an army bring ice cream machines to the front? How could they operate surgical theaters under canvas in a swamp? The answer, though the Japanese analysts never fully grasped it, was that the Americans were not bringing luxury. They were bringing standardization. Every field hospital was laid out identically, so that medics transferred from one unit could work immediately in another. Every supply crate was marked with color-coded stencils so that even illiterate laborers could route materiel correctly. The system was designed to function at scale, and scale was something the Americans had in abundance. By mid-November, the strategic picture had clarified. The Americans controlled the coast and the airfields. The Japanese held the interior, a mountainous spine of jungle where 14,000 troops were dug into positions that could not be easily flanked. A frontal assault would have been costly. The American command, learning from previous campaigns, chose instead to contain. Artillery batteries positioned on the coastal plain could range any target in the interior. Navy guns offshore provided additional fire support. The Japanese were not attacked. They were surrounded and subjected to a methodical campaign of attrition. Supply lines were cut. Reinforcement barges were sunk by air patrol. The jungle, which the Japanese had once considered an ally, became a trap. The air war intensified. Marine and Army pilots flew up to 6 sorties a day from the Bougainville airstrips, striking Japanese positions on the island and hitting shipping around Rabaul. The Japanese air response, once formidable, dwindled as losses mounted. By December, American pilots were reporting minimal opposition. The skies over Bougainville, once contested, belonged to the Americans. The Japanese troops in the interior could hear the bombers overhead, droning toward Rabaul, and knew their isolation was complete. The tactical language of the campaign reflected the grinding, methodical nature of the fighting. Radio logs from Marine forward observers read like industrial checklists. Fire mission. Grid 563419er. Troops in the open. Proximity fuse. 4 rounds adjust. Artillery batteries responded with the precision of factory machinery, shells landing in tight patterns, walking across suspected Japanese positions with devastating effect. The enemy had no counter-battery capability. Their guns had been destroyed in the opening bombardment or lacked the ammunition for sustained fire. The result was a slow, mechanical erosion of Japanese defensive capability. Miriam Ashford's role expanded in ways she had not anticipated. As the perimeter stabilized, she was tasked with coordinating not just supply but civil affairs, the processing of displaced local populations, the establishment of labor battalions, the distribution of medical aid to villagers caught between the armies. The work was unglamorous and exhausting, a daily negotiation between limited resources and unlimited need. Her letters home, always brief, took on a different tone. There are children here who have never seen a doctor. We have medicine. We have food. The arithmetic is simple, but the solutions are not. The Japanese launched a major counteroffensive in March 1944, a three-pronged assault aimed at recapturing the airfields. 20,000 troops, many starving and sick, attacked out of the jungle in coordinated night assaults. The Americans, warned by intelligence intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, were ready. Artillery plastered the likely assembly areas. Machine gun positions, sited in interlocking fields of fire, caught the Japanese in the open. The counteroffensive broke within 72 hours, shattered by firepower and logistics. The Japanese lost 5,000 dead. American casualties were a tenth of that. The aftermath was grim. Burial details worked for a week. Medical personnel treated Japanese wounded according to Geneva protocols, a decision that caused resentment among some American troops but was enforced by command. POW compounds were established inland, away from the airfields. Rations were equalized. Japanese prisoners received the same caloric intake as American troops, a fact that astonished them. Interrogations revealed the extent of Japanese deprivation. Soldiers who had not eaten a full meal in 2 months, units that had resorted to eating tree bark and insects. The contrast was stark and deliberate. The Americans wanted their prisoners to understand the futility of continued resistance. The campaign settled into an uneasy equilibrium. The Americans controlled the coast and continued to expand their airfield complex. The Japanese held isolated pockets in the interior, bypassed, contained, irrelevant. Rabaul, once the linchpin of Japanese power in the South Pacific, was pounded daily by bombers flying from Bougainville. The fortress became a siege, its 100,000 troops unable to influence the war beyond their perimeter. The strategy of bypass and neutralization, refined on Bougainville, became doctrine. The Americans would use it again at Truk, at Palau, at a dozen other fortified islands. The lesson was clear. You did not need to take every stronghold. You only needed to make it irrelevant. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Prisoners spoke of a sense of abandonment, of fighting a war that had already been lost. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo exhorted the garrison to hold, to die with honor, but no supplies came, no reinforcements arrived. The men in the jungle understood they had been written off. Some units maintained discipline to the end. Others fragmented, soldiers slipping away into the interior, choosing slow starvation over futile battle. The Americans found corpses in the jungle for months afterward, men who had simply walked away and died alone. Miriam Ashford remained on Bougainville until August 1944, 9 months after the invasion. Her work shifted from crisis logistics to sustainment, the less dramatic but equally vital task of maintaining throughput as the island became a rear area base. She coordinated the rotation of combat units, the expansion of storage facilities, the establishment of rest camps where exhausted troops could recover before returning to the line. Her efficiency earned her a promotion and a transfer to Leyte, where the Philippines campaign was ramping up. She left Bougainville on a transport flight, looking down at the island as it receded into the green haze of the horizon. Her final letter from Bougainville was written the night before her departure. I do not know if what we have done here will be remembered. The victories are loud and the logistics are silent. But I have seen what happens when the supply fails, and I have seen what happens when it does not. The difference is measured in lives. That is enough. The Japanese garrison on Bougainville did not surrender until August 1945, when the war ended. By then, they were a ghost army, depleted by disease and starvation, incapable of offensive action. The Americans, having achieved their strategic objective, had stopped attacking them months earlier. There was no point. The jungle had done its work. The lessons of Bougainville rippled outward. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare was as much about throughput as firepower, that an army's reach depended not on the courage of its soldiers but on the efficiency of its supply chain. The Japanese, despite their tactical skill and willingness to die, had been defeated by a force they could not see, the vast industrial machinery of American logistics. It was not a dramatic defeat. There were no decisive battles, no climactic moments. The Japanese were simply overwhelmed, day by day, ton by ton, until resistance became meaningless. The American military absorbed the lessons and refined them. Field manuals were rewritten. Logistics officers, once considered re-echelon functionaries, gained status and authority. The organizational structures that had improvised success on Bougainville were codified, standardized, and deployed across the Pacific. By 1945, the American war machine operated with a ruthless efficiency that the Japanese could not match. Every island invasion followed the Bougainville model: overwhelming firepower, rapid airfield construction, and a supply system that could sustain operations indefinitely. The human cost of the campaign was asymmetric. American casualties on Bougainville totaled around 700 killed and 2,000 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 10,000 dead, with thousands more succumbing to disease. The disparity reflected not just firepower but the fundamental difference in how each side approached the war. The Americans fought to win. The Japanese fought to die with honor. The jungle, indifferent to ideology, consumed both. In the decades after the war, Bougainville faded from memory. The airfields were reclaimed by jungle. The supply dumps rusted into the soil. The island, once a critical node in the American advance, became a footnote in histories that focused on Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the dramatic battles, the bloody assaults. But for the men who fought there, and for the planners who studied it, Bougainville represented something more significant: proof that wars could be won not through superior courage but through superior systems. Miriam Ashford survived the war and returned to the United States in January 1946. She never spoke publicly about her service, deflecting questions with a brief smile and a change of subject. Her personnel file, declassified decades later, contained commendations from officers who credited her with saving lives through logistical innovation. She married, taught mathematics at a high school in Ohio, and died in 1987. Her obituary did not mention Bougainville. Her students remembered her as demanding but fair, a woman who insisted that problems, no matter how complex, could be solved if you broke them down into manageable pieces. The sky over Bougainville is still green at the edges, where the jungle meets the horizon. The airfields are gone, swallowed by vegetation. The supply dumps have corroded into unrecognizable shapes. The graves are maintained, neat rows of white crosses, but they are visited infrequently. The island has returned to what it was before the war: remote, quiet, dense with life that pays no attention to history. But the lesson remains. War is not only about killing, it is about sustaining. An army that can feed itself, repair itself, move itself, will outlast an enemy that cannot, no matter how brave that enemy may be. The Japanese soldiers on Bougainville were brave. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They held positions that should have been overrun. They died rather than surrender. None of it mattered. They were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could afford to attrit them indefinitely. The Americans understood this. They brought not just guns but generators, not just soldiers but systems. They turned logistics into a weapon more devastating than artillery, more decisive than air superiority. The jungle, which the Japanese had believed would be their ally, became a neutral battlefield where the advantage went to whoever could project power sustainably. The Americans could. The Japanese could not. The outcome was never in doubt. In the end, the horror the Japanese troops felt was not the horror of combat. It was the horror of obsolescence, of realizing they were fighting an enemy that existed in a different technological epoch. The ice cream machines, the electric lights, the fresh eggs, these were not luxuries. They were symbols of a gap that could not be bridged through courage or sacrifice. The Americans had brought the 20th century to Bougainville. The Japanese were still fighting a 19th century war. That realization, more than any battle, broke the Japanese will. You could train soldiers to die. You could not train them to fight against the future. The wind returned to Bougainville in the years after the war, the wet green wind that smells of growth and decay. The jungle swallowed the runways, the foxholes, the rusted trucks. The rain washed away the blood. The island forgot. But the officers who studied the campaign, who pored over the manifests and the throughput charts and the casualty ratios, did not forget. They understood what had been proven in that green hell, that wars are won in the supply depots as much as on the battlefield, that tonnage per hour is a weapon as lethal as any rifle, and that the nation which can feed its soldiers will outlast the nation which cannot. The sky over Bougainville is silent now. The bombers are gone, the fighters are gone, the voices on the radio have faded into static. What remains is the lesson, hard one and irrefutable. Bring your logistics or bring your defeat. There is no third option.